Hello, hello. It is me, Legendary, and today I am presenting The War in the West, a colonial war story that spanned throughout World Conquest 126, which up until this point is Foxhole's longest and deadliest war. It spanned 70 real-life days and had well over 8 million casualties throughout the entire war. I am making this video more as a historical document to illustrate the amount of effort that all the colonials on the western side of the map put in to ultimately bring forth victory for the colonial faction in this war. It was a long war, it was a great war, and I feel inclined to put the record into the history books so that future wars might be able to look back and see how this historic war played out. So let's jump in, and I'll be yapping about exactly what went on in the West, how the colonial side managed to push north and ultimately end up in Speaking Woods, which was the second MPF town that almost fell and won us the war. Right, so before we get started, we need to talk about the largest coalition that took hold of the Western Front throughout this war. So, introducing the Sons of the Legion, or SOL for short. So, what is SOL exactly? Well, SOL is essentially just a coalition of several colonial regiments that banded together and play under one banner. The members of SOL include Air, HVL, NCR, Para, Ember, Phoenix, KOP, Bunny, VF, and it also had Echelon or ECH. They had recently departed SOL just due to inactivity. However, these were the people that ultimately built up and held onto the Western Front alongside any other smaller regiments that played alongside us. So, what is important about SOL's lane? So just for people who don't know exactly what a lane is, throughout Foxhole, in a typical north versus south war, where Warden's on the north and colonials are in the south, most of the time the way that coalitions and regiments align themselves is they choose a base of operation on the south side of the map and ultimately aim to push north. There is some leeway with pushing into islands or pushing left and right if the need arises for some tactical decision, but for the most part, regiments and coalitions decide to fight inside these lanes. So these are the sort of boundaries that players make up, and it makes for really good organization between different coalitions and different regiments so that they know exactly where and when resources are going to be sent and how collaboration is going to take place. So this is a very common tactic in the colonial side to choose a lane and to send a equal amount of vets and new players to each lane to help balance things out. So for War 126, SOL chose the western lane. So this is obviously from the starting point of origin that goes into Westgate, which was our two primary hexes that we fought in. And then ultimately we attacked into Fahrenheit Coast, which was controlled by the Wardens, and Nevish Line, which was the Warden primary Logi hub for this entire lane and throughout this entire war as well. Just to give you an idea of what the other lanes within this war also more or less played out in, this is a intel map from the Sigil Intelligence Discord, and this was just basically what War 126 looked like. So here you can see we claimed the left-hand side of the map, so SOL was going to attack into Fahrenheit Coast, like I explained, and of course we had HVL, which was the main Logi regiment for SOL, or based out of Origin, but also helped out in Ashfields as well as a little bit in Sableport. So for the most part, you can see we're on the west-hand side, and notably some of the other larger coalitions, which are illustrated in yellow, had different lanes that they participated in. Notably, we have WCI, which was in the King's Cage lane, FLA in Lockmore, NEP in the middle in Deadlands, CRA, NOP, CCA, Valley, and AEF. For the most part, we won't be talking too much about the other coalitions, with the exception of FLA and WCI, which had a direct influence in the outcome of the Western War, alongside some additional regiments who came to help out during one key operation. All right, now let's talk a little bit about our lane opponents. So it's all good and well if we just talk about the colonial side, but as we progressed through the lane in War 126, we also stumbled upon a couple of Warden bases amongst the rubble that we flattened. And through this rubble, we were able to discern what the lane looked like on our defeated foes, or what their primary makeup was. Notably, the two largest regiments that we fought was 82DK and JKL. 82DK is primarily a European-based regiment that is well known for performing large-scale operations during the weekend. JKL is a engineering regiment that is primarily based in Thailand, I believe, but I think they are primarily Southeast Asian in general. They're very well known for their tanking, so 82DK and JKL were the primary lane opponents that did the majority of the constructing on the northern side of the western lane for the Warden faction. Most notably, we also had UKR with their partisan ops, as well as Kaker providing logistics. Finally, although not directly in our lane, it is worth noting that Legio helped build up the Manacle and was a massive thorn in Soul's side, which ultimately required us to take very extreme measures against their base of operation to unseat the primary push power that they had built up in King's Cage. So very notable that Legio was in this lane, as well as a multitude of several other Warden regiments who assisted these primary actors. So those were the main threat that we faced on the west coast, and again, they put up a good fight alongside all the other various random regiments that chipped in here and there. All right, so now that we've set the stage, we know who all the actors are, let's talk a little bit about how the logistic networks was set up for the backbone of the Soul industry. So like I said, HVL was primarily based out of Origin. Within Origin, we built up one oil field inside of Initium. We collaborated with NCR, another Soul member, to build up a large quantity of processed construction materials, which basically built the backbone that flowed throughout the rest of Soul. Notably, we produced a lot of trains. We built a lot of 300mm shells, as well as provide materials for our coal team that assisted in producing battle tanks, SPGs, and railstorm cannons. And we also provided some material support for the Velian fleet, another Soul member that produced a lot of large ships for PvP combat. What's very important was Tekotima was a refinery town during this war, so we based a lot of our BMAT and EMAT based logistics out of Origin. Ashfield was also a refinery town, and although we didn't primarily build up Ashtown as HVL, but a lot of members within Soul used Ashfields, or Ashtown specifically, as their primary refineries within Soul, and they helped stockpile the seaport full of materials there so that we could primarily use the MPF available from there. Within Sableport, we also had a coalfield claim through Sigil. This is where we produced most of our heavy weapons. Like I said, mostly battle tanks, SPGs, and railstorm cannons came out of this base in Sableport, so obviously we had a vested interest in making sure that our lane succeeded very well so that Sableport never came under threat. Additionally, Air had a coal field situated in Westgate where they produced a lot of coal-based materials, specifically concrete as a byproduct for the coal liquefaction process, So a lot of the concrete, if not all the concrete that was used to build up Westgate and the multitude of fortresses within Westgate came from this coalfield that was run by air. There was a secondary coalfield that was claimed near the north-hand side of Westgate. I think that was also help run by air as well as para, but this was more of a joint operation by a lot of regiments that operated within Westgate and not our primary field. But very noteworthy that we used a lot of concrete from this facility to help push the lane north. And most of the concrete cores that we tapped from any ground that we gained came from this facility. So this is where our primary backline logistics facilities and structures got their resources from. Right, moving forward, let's talk about factory logi. So where did all the logi come from? Our primary base was in Tegatima within Origin. It had two factories as well as a refinery. So that's where we were producing most of the factory-based items such as weapons and of course the various utility materials and uniforms that are required to help fuel the front line. And like I said, Ash Fields or Ashtown specifically had an MPF town, and we utilized the MPF town there to build most of our vehicles. So these are the main contributing factors that helped us supply Westgate, which notably lets me talk about Longstone. So the Longstone seaport is where we based 90% of our operations out of. So we made sure we had a very solid train loop, both from Ashfields, Origin, as well as a little bit from Sableport into Longstone, a very large train loop that allowed us to continuously supply that front with the required materials. Later on in the war, we did push further north. We also set up a secondary train loop into Kingstone to just ensure that we had another storage depot that was fully stocked with Soul-ready supplies. And then we pushed further north into Victor, Bonehaft, and Scrying Belt, but more on that a little bit later. For the majority of the war, like I said, about 90% of War 126, this was our primary factory logi loop, and we made sure to supply it daily. Now, in terms of facility logi, we also made use of all the various constructible, creatable materials that, again, made its way to our primary logi hub or logi seaport, which was Longstone. Notably, I need to talk about our mini MPF facility. We had one mini MPF facility, but we had to move locations halfway through the war due to threat of a nuclear strike. So we originally had our mini MPF facility on the north-hand side of Origin, which was powered by one of Air's oil facilities, but we ultimately moved it into Finis, where it comfortably sat throughout the rest of the war. Additionally, we also had two primary shell factories that helped produce shells for the front. Throughout the midway point of the war, we converted a portion of the processed construction material facility in the NCR/HVL collaboration facility to produce 300 mil, and we produced a lot of 300 mil in that facility, and that powered all the storm cannons and railstorm cannons that we used throughout the war. Additionally, Para, which is an artillery-based regiment, also produced a massive and absolutely gigantic large shell facility off of two salvage mines that was based just south of Knight's Edge, and that produced most of the 150 shells and as well as the HE rockets that was used to push north. Ultimately, I also just wanted to mention that our coal team had all the large facility pads required to make big explosive weapons. So, like I said, SPGs, BTs all came from this Sableport facility. And then finally, new to the Soul Regiment was the Valiant Fleet Coalition. So new to the Soul Coalition is the Valiant Fleet Regiment, and they had a dry dock based somewhere in Ashfields. So they produced a lot of large ships, although those primarily were used for PvP combat and didn't see much coastal bombardment until mostly near the end of the war. So that's where they produced their ships from, and of course they were provided a lot of materials throughout the coalition to help fund their large ship production line. Right, now that we've talked about facilities and logi lines, let's talk a little bit about the defenses. This is a very important thing to keep in mind, as the majority of a lot of our maintenance supply production went into fueling and powering the defenses that protected our lane. First and foremost, let's talk about the Origin Atlantic Wall Defense project. This was a project that was ran and maintained by the HVL guys, which is us, and the primary goal of the Origin Atlantic Wall was basically just to protect against any funny naval landings. So this project, ran by the entirety of HVL, spanned multiple build projects, which ultimately ended up in a large concrete fortress that spanned the entire coastline of Origin. So we had multiple bunker bases, multiple howitzers, multiple landing areas that were covered in AT, MGs, mines, barbed wire, you name it, we built it, and we basically lined every possible landing spot on the left-hand side of Origin with multiple defenses to protect against any form of landing, partisan work, etc. Additionally, we also produced the Tekotima 5G network, which allowed us to get clairvoyance in all of the Warden operations that took place inside of Stemmer's Landing. This was facilitated by 6 high engine room intelligence centers, which basically just ran 24/7. Whenever we had an HVL member log on, it was their job to run to the intel centers, make sure that they were all firing. These were public use intel centers, so anyone could easily go and use them to get clear intel on any forewarning from naval invasions that took place from Stemmer's Landing, as we had given most of that region up to the Wardens, which I'll talk about in just a bit. Notably, we had 3 primary coastal defense guns in the form of storm cannons. We had 2 storm cannons that we built and maintained in near the central area of Origin, and then there was a small regiment who built up a storm cannon in Initium, and this was from the guys from Cast. It was their first sort of build project for the war, and they were happy to produce essentially a public storm cannon which could be used to shoot 300 mil at any approaching ships. Sadly, most of these storm cannons didn't see too much action, as most of the Wardens decided to respect and fear the Origin Atlantic Wall defense, and besides 1 or 2 pirate frigates and a couple of Naki attack subs that tried to sneak through the bridges, they did not get very far. So the storm cannons were, for the most part, 99% of the war, completely silent. But it was a necessary defense, and if the Wardens were to bring a large naval invasion into Origin, they would have met the wrath of our cannons. Finally, we also had a longhook stationed in the middle of the Initium Bay, and this was again just to protect against any gunboats or any motorboats that tried to sneak past the bridges, as the coastal gun in Initium does not cover the entire bridge area itself. So we needed to bring in a automated defense ship to just help cover the blind spots in the coastal defense. All right. Notably not shown, we also had several other longhooks stationed throughout Origin. I'm not going to reveal their location, as we might use them again in future wars. But that being said, they were around and were one of our longhook to be pirated or destroyed or attacked by a submarine. We had replacements ready to swap in the damaged ship, or if the ship was sunk, we could easily replace it within 5 to 10 minutes. Additionally, we had multiple artillery batteries. I think we had 8 individual areas for artillery strikes. And again, I'm not going to show their locations, but if you're quite clever with figuring out where to put strategic areas, you could probably discern where they were And again, they also didn't see too much action, but they were ready to be deployed, ready to be used, and had storage rooms filled with 150 ammo, 120 ammo, as well as HE rockets, ready to bombard any incoming attacks. And then finally, we had a neighbor to HVL who had a railstorm cannon at the ready within Origin. This was well hidden somewhere within the hex as well, so if the storm cannons were taken down, we did have an ally ready to use a railstorm cannon. So additionally, more 300mm ready to bombard any Warden invasions that tried to dare come into Origin itself. Okay, I'm going to quickly fly through Westgate. Again, I'm not showing specific detail, but notably within Westgate, we had the Westgate Fortress. This was a large fortress project that spanned throughout the entire Sol coalition. We built up everything just north of Kingstone, and Kingstone had 2 storm cannons that protected the coast from any aforementioned naval invasions. Most notably, within Fortress Westgate, we situated a nuclear site. This was built and maintained by air. However, the protection of that nuke site was a coalition level defense measure. Additionally, we had sundry facilities built within Westgate as well. Specifically, we had areas where we stored our BTs, SPGs, etc. This was also built somewhere within Westgate. I'm not going to reveal that location, as again, it was a nice location. We might use it in future wars. We did get that facility raided once throughout the war, but we discovered a critical flaw in the facility's design. We fixed it, and we were never raided again. There were a couple of attempts, but none of them succeeded. Most notably within Westgate as well is we also had a large-scale fortress that was built on the western coast. This was to prevent any sort of flanking naval invasions that usually come from Whitewick's side over here. And although the Wardens did place themselves on quote-unquote Cuba multiple times within Westgate, we quickly repelled them, and then we stuck to our guns, which was building up and maintaining the Westgate fortress. And unfortunately for Wardens, they never got close to testing the Westgate fortress defenses. For the most part, they were hard stuck in between the gallows and Ranchers Fast, and they never made any progress beyond that. So this also brings in a new term that we sort of soft coined within HVL, which was the crumple zone. And the crumple zone was basically just an area on the north side of West Coast where we basically didn't try and build too deep into that zone. The reason for this is the Wardens aimed 5 storm cannons at Westgate throughout the entirety of the war. And if we ever tried to put anything sizable or concrete within the crumple zone, it basically was just 300mm shots bombarding it before it ultimately ended up dying. We did experiment a lot with trenches to try and build up the crumple zone, but ultimately that too didn't hold very long, as 300mm was very, very oppressive this war, and ultimately made us change our battle plans throughout the war so that we could ultimately end up with the W. But that's essentially how we planned for Westgate, and this is how it played out. It was quite back and forth between the crumple zone areas, but like I said, they never got past Westgate Fortress, and our Logi line was never compromised, which was a really good effort by Sol, and ultimately ended up burning out most of the Wardens as they couldn't progress further south in Westgate throughout the entirety of the war. Okay. And then notably, let's talk about island defenses. So let's talk exactly how Sol managed to defend the islands and ultimately the result of those decisions that took place. So for islands, we didn't care at all. Like, there was no plan for the islands. We knew Stemmer Landing and Fisherman's Row was good for some facility LARP, but these were not victory points. We didn't see a need to capture them. And besides just sending some Logi and a little bit of gunboat QRF every now and then, honestly speaking, we didn't defend Stemmer's Landing. A little bit of ops took place here and there, some smaller groups partisaning things, but we just collectively said that naval LARP is naval LARP. We didn't care about it, so we focused on the main fight, and that decision ultimately played off positively in our favor, as the Wardens controlling Fisherman's Row and Stemmen Landing for the majority of the war had absolutely no impact on the Western Front at all. So yeah, sorry to the guys who constantly had to QRF their fingers, as Stemma was used for quite a few of the naval invasions staging area, but ultimately fingers didn't fail either, so that's a big W from their side. And yeah, Stemma and Fisherman's Row was just blue, and we genuinely didn't care. Okay, from this point, let's talk about major Sol operations. So now I'm just going to cover exactly the large-scale operations that at a coalition level, all the things that we participated in, and also the major battles that took place throughout the war. Now, keep in mind that War 126 spanned over 70 IRL days. It was quite long and quite tedious, so I'm skipping a lot of these sort of smaller operations that took place. If you're a regular on my YouTube channel and you see a lot of my YouTube shorts, you'll see that I have a host of different shorts that took place throughout this war, and it spanned from flamethrower ops to tank ops to artillery ops. Basically, all of those operations took place during this war, and they all contributed to the eventual push that led into the north side within the Warden regions. So, again, this section is just the majority of Sol operations that took place, so let me dive in and explain everything significant that took place and reminisce a little bit about how all these operations played out. Alright, so let's start with day 0 to 2 throughout the start of the war. So as the war started out, there was a lot more neutral ground generated from the devs as they started to experiment with new starting conditions and new starting resources throughout the map to sort of instigate the starting point for this long conquest. Most notably, the major gains that took place on day 0 was Sol's major push into Faranac Coast. We did actually manage to push in and capture both Jade Cove as well as House Hollow, and we did make a very strong attempt to take Terra, but unfortunately the Wardens did manage to push back quite a bit. Unfortunately, King's Cage had a much worse deal than us. So Legio as well as a couple of additional support regiments pushed south from the Bailey into King's Cage. 27th was involved with that as well, and most of King's Cage, notably the Manacle and Slip Chain, was turned blue very, very quickly. This resulted in quite a few of Sol's partisan groups to divert attention to try and retake Slip Chain, but unfortunately this didn't bode too well. Ultimately, what ended up happening was Slip Chain as well as the Manacle became quite a bastion for Warden Logi, as well as a new front that pushed west, and that resulted in the southern areas of Faranac Coast to constantly get partisaned, and that then ultimately led to a lot of burnout from that initial momentum and allowed the Wardens to push us all the way back into Victor. And Victor became a stronghold and the last colonial sub-region within Faranac for the majority of the coast. Unfortunately, this also had a diverse effect against the coalition called WCI, as due to a sudden operation mostly orchestrated from 27th Legio and a couple of additional partisans, they managed to land several barges next to Gibbet Fields, which was the last remaining storage depot within King's Cage, and they managed to tap the town hall and destroy the depot. This resulted in a lot of Logi having to be pushed up from Sableport, and this burnt out a lot of the WCI coalition members that essentially forced them to either play defensively within Sableport and build up, and never really re-engage with King's Cage for the majority of the war. Luckily, there is a silver lining to the story, which I will eventually get to as we get throughout the various operations. So, that being said, Seoul, even though we pushed very deep into Fahrenheit Coast and managed to capture a lot of territory very, very quickly, notably the 2 large cities in Fahrenheit Coast, we ultimately lost our ground by day 2, as ultimately the counter flanks coming from our eastern flank or the western flank from King's Cage ultimately overwhelmed us. We just couldn't hold the ground, and WCI not being able to hold their lane and falling back to Sableport also contributed to this difficulty. Now, for 2 weeks, this was basically the lane. Victor held out very, very strong, and that too fell after about 2 weeks of back and forth from a large amount of 82DK, UKR, and JKL ops that continuously flooded down the ramp from Jade Cove into Victor and into that lane as well. As a result of this, King's Cage managed to build up quite significantly. The town hall obviously managed to tech up to industry as well as into tier 3, and this became a stable logistical hub for the western flank as well. Most notably, the Manacle had a garage. Now, this is a significant resource for the Warden faction, as a majority of their medium to heavy armor basically relies on the armor statistics within their stats pool. Colonial tanks, generally speaking, rely on HP to carry them into battle. Warden vehicles specifically primarily focus on armor. So having a garage on the front line is a really, really big deal if you're playing on the Warden side, and you should always try and defend your garages as best as possible. Never let them get tapped or get destroyed, as they can carry you strong for the majority of the war. And this was ultimately seen as the Warden tech tree progressed into Brigands and Silverhands, as we can clearly see that at this point, day 25 of the war, a massive offensive from Legio, as well as 27th, as well as some Asian regiments. I think Acto was also involved in this, managed to take all of King's Cage and again retap Gibbets Field, and ultimately now put pressure on Sableport as well as into Westgate, as there were several sorties coming from Slipchain and now from Scarlet Hold to threaten our fortress, and it got very close to the Wardens getting to our main concrete line, which is something that we didn't want them to achieve. So because of this, there was a large-scale Soul operation to push back the massive offensive that was built up within King's Cage. Notably, we wanted to take Scarlet Hold back, and we wanted to flip Gibbet Fields. So because of this, the remainder of WCI as well as 420th managed to build up a large-scale operation based out of Sableport and a little bit out of the Lockmore region. They pushed into Gibbet, managed to retake the storage depot, and I led several partisan groups scattered throughout different time zones to put pressure on the 27th base that was built up around Scarlet Hold. Again, if you are a enjoyer of some of my YouTube shorts, you may have seen the Arsonist, HVL Arsonist versus the Warden Fire Department. That was that essentially attack over here on day 29. And if you also saw my Falchion tank rush, where we would rush Falchions into the base of the bridge just south of the Manacle that led into Scarlet Hold, where we, destroyed the bridge and cut the Logi line. I also led multiple tank operations during these attacks as well. So HVL was very present throughout this fight, and again, this was to alleviate all the pressure that was pushing into Sableport. Talon's Fort did manage to get tapped blue several times, mostly by the Act O regiment, which then would brought up artillery to go and assault the bulwark defensive bases that was built up by WCI. But because they were threatening our coal facility and our coal team and putting a lot of pressure on those guys, we managed to dial in as much threat as possible, and ultimately we managed to break through, keep the bridges down, and that held off King's Cage for as long as possible, or at least the southern portion of King's Cage, which then protected our Sableport refinery town. So, because of this mounting pressure, specifically on our coal facility, which was producing our battle tanks, SPGs, and other large-scale equipment, it was at this point that Air managed to upgrade their facility with a nuclear site. They immediately built up and deployed a rocket on top of the rocket pad itself, and in due part to King's Cage providing a garage to the entire region, as well as Legio's dual storm cannons that was pressuring Ranchers Fast, Air decided that they were going to nuke the Manacle. And this was the very first nuke of World Conquest 126, so it is indeed a sole W. We built the first nuke, and we threatened the only remaining Warden garage on the Western Front, which would heavily impact the fact that Wardens would have to drive 2 to 3 hexes north if they ever wanted to repair armor, pushing south deeper into Westgate, Origin, Sableport, etc. So, on day 30, the nuke site was built. We had to constantly QRF the nuke site from various partisan activities. At one point, the Wardens managed to land onto Cuba, which is on the left-hand side of Westgate, where they managed to use a glitched construction vehicle to build a large bridge towards the nuke site to try and hit it with heavy explosive or high explosive rockets. Unfortunately for them, the QRF team was there on standby, and we managed to destroy most of their attempts. And they also tried several other desperate plays, like trying to rush chieftains through the town hall, but unfortunately for them, they didn't quite check the patch notes, and if you run a chieftain through a town hall without shooting any of the garrison houses, you tend to die. So unfortunately for them, their attempted partisan runs ended in complete failure, and the nuke went off and hit the Manacle, bringing forth the first nuclear strike in the game. Unfortunately, the nuke was not in range of the storm cannons, so this ultimately led into a large-scale Sol operation into King's Cage, where we set up a lot of Logi inside of Gibbet Fields, mostly public, but also some reserve. And from Gibbet Fields, we pushed from that eastern flank into Manacle. And again, Fort 20th was pivotal in this battle, as they also provided a lot of infantry and heavy armor assistance to help push into the Manacle to just unseat 27th, as well as destroy the Legio's storm cannons, which luckily enough I was able to be part of that partisan team to run in and destroy the storm cannons, which essentially took off the majority of the threat from Ranchers Fast, or to Ranchers Fast, from those Manacle storm cannons. So it was a massive W, and this operation was a Sol-wide effort to unseat the Warden's control over King's Cage. And since this nuke dropped, the majority of large Warden regiments essentially also decided to abandon the lane. 27th did stick around for a little bit, but Legio, which were the architects that built up the concrete in the region, decided to not play any further. At least we didn't see any of their bunker bases that cropped up after the nuke landed. So essentially, King's Cage became a no man's land hex, with no real colonial regiment taking ownership of it, besides Fort 20th doing some sorties there, and 27th sometimes building a few things up, but didn't really get anywhere without getting demolished on the daily. Alright, now that King's Cage is out of the picture, we've turned our focus squarely back onto Faraday Coast, because ultimately that's where Sol landed short during the very start of the war. We weren't able to push any further north, with Slipchain continuously being a partisan hub for Wardens to cut our Logi lanes and to flank our artillery positions as we made any effort into the majority of the hex. Notably, we also hated that damn ramp. The ramp in Jade Cove, in my opinion, is one of the most easily defendable positions for Wardens in the game. It is incredibly easy to hold. It has 2 Logi bridges that they can make use of, So holding Fahrenheit Coast for a long time as a Warden player is exceptionally easy, and a lot of that sentiment is carried across throughout the rest of Sol. So Air rearmed their rocket site with a new nuclear warhead, and we ultimately decided to destroy Fahrenheit Coast's main town, which was Jade Cove, and unseat the Wardens that had built up the ramp and the surrounding areas around it. Notably, this also took out the seaport. So when we took out King's Cage, we also destroyed the seaport that was used as a logistical hub, and we were aiming for another pivotal seaport that also made bringing Logi from the island hexes as well as Nevish line and Stone Cradle down south into Fahrenheit Coast a lot more difficult for the Wardens unless they utilize the Bluefin. Now, Bluefin logistics is really strong, but it requires constant defense, and it also requires the regiments who own the Bluefin to allow their resources to be used, which is also something worth discussing within the Warden culture of using Bluefins as a form of valid logistical supply lines. Nevertheless, we wanted to get rid of Jade Cove because we hated the ramp, and the seaport was an additional bonus as well. So that's the next target, and when the nuke managed to drop, there was a massive operation on day 40 from Westgate to push into King's Cage and finally unseat the remainder of 27th bases on that western edge of King's Cage to ultimately seal the deal and lock in any additional attempts from Sol to push into the region holistically. So we just basically went to slip chain. We managed to retap the relic base, clear out all the remainder construction that 27th had put down over there, but this ultimately led to a lot of momentum from the Wardens. They kind of have this narrative of once they get nuked, they pile on the resources to try and push back. And for the most part, this was a really big W for the Warden side as well. So losing Jade Cove brought in a lot of momentum, and there was a massive collaborative effort to push south, and Fahrenheit Coast definitely managed to recover from this major operation that took place. Most notably, but during this time period as well, it is worth mentioning that Banga managed to bring up a railstorm cannon situated just outside the gallows. I was running hoist defense for Banga, and their railstorm cannon actually also managed to break a lot of the Warden concrete that was built up on the southern side. A lot of 82DK's concrete fortresses that was built around Pleading Wharf were all turned to rubble, and that was notably performed by Banga's storm cannon. Railstorm cannon, specifically. Okay, the next target that we had our sights on was to destroy the Bailey. Now, luckily, WCI and some additional regiments managed to build up a nuke site within Sableport. This was not a Sol nuke. This was someone else building it up and sustaining it, and they targeted the Bailey. Throughout this time, we did, however, load in our third nuke into the Westgate Fortress nuke site, again built by Air, and throughout the next couple of days, Air decided to target and retarget the nuke, basically just to scare Warden Logi to basically pull resources out of their storage depot, and then we would cancel the nuke and target something else, and then we would force an evacuation there, and ultimately it just led to a little bit of back and forth to essentially see where the best nuke target would be. However, on day 49, I believe, or day 50, it was between 49 and day 50, we managed to spot a really big problem. One of the intel centers that just came online within Westgate, that was just built within range of the north side of Terra, managed to spot something quite dangerous. Within the intel range that was detected, we saw a large concrete foundation square being built dead smack within the Carrion Fields. Now, this is a big problem because there's only one large structure in the game that has that design, and that was a nuke site. We knew that the owners of that particular base, which ultimately we found out was JKL, had built a nuke site location, and they were probably gathering the rares to build up their nuke and strategically place it down when the time was right. It was a good thing that that intel center in Westgate managed to detect this particular area, as we managed to prepare for the nuke that eventually did get built in that square. Right, so on day 51, DEFCON 1 was declared. The Wardens did indeed build a nuke site within Terra. However, we did not predict that they actually built a second nuke site within 10 minutes of each other. And this was the point where Sol clenched a little bit, because now we faced down the barrel of 2 nuke sites built to essentially evaporate the western edge. Oh, just pardon this fake fake tag here. I've got to remove it from the slides. But essentially here, the Wardens were going to nuke Westgate, and you can see that they were targeting our fortress as well as the seaport within Westgate, and had these 2 nukes succeeded, it would have devastated the lane and ultimately probably led to a complete western lane collapse if the Wardens managed to pull this off. But that being said, the Wardens did not anticipate a large-scale coalition level operation in collaboration with a lot of large regiments and coalitions from the middle lane, as well as some from the eastern lane of the war itself, to rally together and push forth into Faranac Coast in a large-scale multi-pronged attack. So on day 51 and day 52, Sol pushed back into Slipchain, set up a large tier 2 base within the Slipchain relic base. From there, we then pushed north into the remaining structures that was built on the eastern side of the Bailey Town Hall, and while 420th managed to push into a large artillery base that was situated on the north of the Bailey, Sol managed to break open that remaining concrete bases. This then resulted in all the border bases that bordered into Faranac Coast to be captured by the coalition, the colonial faction, and this resulted in an overwhelming amount of logi and a lot of build pushing to take place on both the southern side of the Hex, as well as pressuring the town of Mara, which is on the eastern side of Faranac Coast, which had a bridge that led directly to the southern nuke site. This was ultimately just a diversionary tactic, as while this large operation was taking place both in Kingsgate as well as being pushed in from the south along all the border bases, a railstorm cannon that was built up by our coal team was then pushed into Pleading Wharf. It was manned by T3C and had a lot of shells supplied by T3C, as well as various other regiments to support a push, and ultimately ended up by attacking the southern nuke site that was built inside of 82DK's base, which led to it being destroyed, and that caused the nuclear threat to Westgate to dissipate. It is worth noting that 4th, T3C, SOM, and Royal participated in this large-scale operation, as each of them had a disruptive measure against that southern nuke take place. Most notably, due to the timing of these nukes being placed, the Sol nuke that was still prepared by air had a 4-hour lead to attacking any of the 2 nuke sites that was built by the Wardens. Ultimately, this is why the Wardens did use 2 nukes. So in a back and forth battle, we would nuke one of their nuke site, their remaining nuke would then nuke Westgate, and there wouldn't have been enough supplies to rearm the nuke and launch it back at the other nuke site after its payload had been sent. So the Wardens gambled. They gambled big by building 2 nuke sites, and ultimately it did not pay off. As the southern nuke was destroyed, our nuke had a 4-hour timer on the northern nuke, which then resulted in the northern nuke ultimately being removed as well, which we'll see in a couple of slides' time. Again, I just want to reiterate, this was a colonial level operation. Yes, some 404th T3C Royal all brought large-scale artillery to come and attack the nuke sites themselves, but Seoul provided the logistics and a lot of random regiments also chipped in. Most notably, there were also several attempts at stealthily attacking the nuke sites using tridents and destroyers. So shout out to Raid for attempting to destroy the northern nuke with their destroyer flanking in from the Bonehaft. Unfortunately did not succeed. The Warden QRF was too strong. And also notably shout out to CAF, who sent out a trident to sneak right next to the southern nuke, but unfortunately a frigate was there on hand to depth charge them into submission. So again, colonial level operation. It was absolutely terrifying but exhilarating at the same time, and ultimately the southern nuke was destroyed by T3C's Otto, the Field Marshal Otto in T3C, managed to snuck in and use the Railstorm Cannon and the shells that they provided to finish off the nuclear threat. And just for reference, this is what the operational map looked like about halfway through the attack. So here you can see we literally had all the border bases that went into Faranac Coast, and large-scale operation across all boards. And as you can see, there was a sneaky train line that came in from Gibbet Fields, and that's ultimately where Grand showed up from. And the final position was right over here, just south of the relic base in Pleading Wharf. That's where the Railstorm Cannon deployed, shot, and destroyed the nuke that was situated inside the square, as you can see over here. So this all took place over the course of 2 IRL days, so day 51 and day 52, and this led to a massive success for the entire colonial faction. Not just Seoul, not just HVL, but everyone managed to get the big W here. All right. So with the southern nuke in Faranac Coast now destroyed by the Railstorm Cannon, this meant that the next nuke that landed from Westgate, the 4th nuke, hit the relic base of Terra. This was also in range of the nuke that the Wardens had built there, so that led to another nuke site dying and another relic base falling way for the Wardens. With all the threats from nuclear detersion, as well as any form of coordinated QRF from Faranac being drained, they used most of their supplies to defend those nuke sites. That opened the door for Grand to have its way with the remaining concrete that was persistent throughout Faranac Coast. Notably, a large-scale concrete base that was built up around Mara was flattened by the Railstorm Cannon, as well as all the storm cannons and supporting concrete structures around Terra were either swept away by the nuke or destroyed by the Railstorm Cannon as well. Notably, Royal, who managed to organize a large Retarius operation of HE rockets, managed to destroy the majority of the storm cannon battery banks, which is just large amounts of engine rooms that were used to power the storm cannons on the daily. So because of Royal's large-scale HE rocket operation, the storm cannons didn't have the energy to retaliate against Grand. So all the pieces kind of fell into place. Soul claiming all the border bases, lots of diversionary tactics from infantry and tanks and artillery from around the side, a lot of SPG work from PH, from SOM, from Para. Everyone contributed to both nuclear sites being taken out. And then ultimately, it paved the way for the Railstorm Cannon to come in, and of course, 420th holding onto King's Gate to prevent any flanks coming from Stone Cradle to protect Mara was also quite pivotal. So grand scale colonial efforts went into destroying the Faranac Coast nukes, and this led to a turning point in the war. This was the turning point. At this point, we had broken the Warden morale. They had lost their nuke sites, which was a large amount of rare alloy investment, and we unseated 2 very strong Warden regiments from the region. This ultimately led us to a large-scale sole effort to build our gains and to push further north as best as possible. So after day 52, after as long as possible, we finally managed to crack the Warden defensive line, and now we set our sights north. We were going for Nevish line. We were going for Callum's Cape. We were going to win the war, and that's indeed how it all played out. So, at this point, we had a large amount of gains across the board. Notably, Air built a new nuke site that was situated just south of Gibbet Fields. This particular nuke managed to nuke Stone Cradle, specifically the main port city of Buckler Sound, and again, yet another seaport the Wardens no longer have access to. It is worth noting that another nuke site was built in Lockmore. Unfortunately, this got partisaned by a group of players from DNA. So what ended up a massive loss for the colonials, where a nuke site was destroyed. The nuke site was not built by Salt, was built and managed by, I think it was FLA. So unfortunately that nuke got partisaned, but that ultimately ended up being a blessing in disguise, because that nuke site was actually targeting Fading Lights within Stone Cradle, and Fading Lights is the last refinery town before we could push further north into the Warden logistical lines. And because that nuke got partisaned, that nuke never went off. So the colonials managed to push into Stone Cradle, capture the town and tech industry, which ultimately then ended up in a refinery town on the very front, which ultimately helped push the Lynn of Mercy further north as well. However, for the western coast, this also meant that we were able to gain a massive amount of momentum pushing north in Faranac Coast itself. What had led to multiple days of a stalemate in the Bonehaft, which is the northernmost town base in Faranac Coast and yet another large Warden bastion that was quite difficult to take due to the hill that is present on it, because we managed to break Stone Cradle, break off any additional support, specifically large ships that could easily come and support the Faranac Coast defensive line, we were able to ultimately get into the town using havocs and smoke grenades, destroy the town hall, and then tap it to reset the Warden industry and destroy all the G houses that was present within. Of course, this wasn't over for the Wardens, and despite the large amount of gains that took place within Stone Cradle, a large number of Warden vessels started to break away from the siege of the Fingers to ultimately come back and help Faranac Coast in breaking our builds that we managed to get within Bonehaft, reset the town hall, and then provide another staging area for Warden defenders to attack south into Faranac Coast and into Scarp of Ambrose and the bunker bases that we built around Terra. But this gains weren't held for too long, as one of the key contributing factors that led to the fall of Nevish line was indeed the fall of Stone Cradle. So because we invested that nuke into Buckler Sound, because we managed to assist taking Fading Lights and build up those gains, a large amount of colonials managed to push into the Dais, which is the last relic base that was built up within Stone Cradle. This ultimately led to the Hex falling to the green team entirely. This was a notable achievement within the turn into Nevish line, because this resulted in border bases between Stone Cradle, Callum's Cape, and Nevish line itself. What had been a back and forth fight to control Bonehaft for the majority of the war now became a complete and utter steamroll, as a border base now spontaneously existed next to the last remaining storage depot on the eastern side of the hex, which was Missile Shrine. And as you can see on day 62, the moment that these border bases cropped into existence, both on the south side and on the eastern edge, the soul momentum carried us into battle, and we managed to destroy and tap the town hall, so no more storage depot available from there. Additionally, a defensive storm cannon that was built up next to Blackcoat Way on the western side of Nevish Line used all of its energy to turn towards Missile Shrine to start bombarding the colonial gains with 300. This ultimately did cause a lot of Grief Mother's defenses as well as Missile Shrine to turn back blue, but it was at this point that I managed to see an opportunity to attack another storage depot that was built, or not properly built up, in the western edge of that hex. So, when I saw that storm cannon turn and shoot Missile Shrine, I knew we had a chance to do a quick naval invasion of the Scrying Belt. So, deploying out of Victor, I managed to get a whole bunch of HVL partisans on top of barges and inside CVs and Spathers and ballistas. And we managed to go all the way into Blackcoat Way's shoreline, deploy onto the town itself, quickly roll in, destroy the town hall, and then tap the town hall and destroy the storage depot. And without industry, the Wardens yet again lost another storage depot, and the last storage depot that was available on that western side. So because of this, Missile Shrine was tapped, so no storage depot on the eastern side. Blackcoat Way was destroyed and tapped, no storage depot on the western side. That meant that the only remaining logistical line for the Wardens in Nevish Line was the town itself. And if you know about how sieges work in Foxhole, if you have no supporting line to a singular town, it tends to get tapped very quickly. And within one day or within 24 hours, all of Seoul managed to build up into Missile Shrine, push across the bridge into Scrying Belt, and Scrying Belt was ultimately tapped very, very quickly. So again, just controlling the storage depots managed to sway the battle in our favor, and even though the Wardens didn't have that many defenders and a lot of enthusiasm to defend Nevish Line, it was ultimately taken in a day. And this is the important thing to realize about all of our Soul operations is morale. We were high morale. We were very motivated. We were yelling in, at here commands every single day to get everyone involved to push Nevish Line so that we could end the war, and the Wardens just weren't defending. And even though they claim they had bluefins and large ships out the wazoo to constantly caress us, we didn't see them. And this is clearly evident at the day-to-day logistical operations being disrupted by our constant partisan operations that took place. Okay. Now, quick interlude. While this was happening, we had noticed that the Wardens had lost the canals that went through the Bonehaft, and they lost the canal that went through the Old Father Relic Base, or whatever that relic base is on the southern side of Nevish. Because of those two canals being controlled by colonials, there was a opportunity to retake all the island hexes that the Wardens had built up over the course of this now 60-day war. So during this time, a DD as well as several other landing craft managed to land around Alchemo Estate within Stemma's Landing, and they started to siege both the town hall as well as the surrounding relic bases in that particular area. Seeing this, I decided to roll up one of our defensive longhooks, load it up with Logi that was situated in Initium as well as Tekotima, and most notably our mini MPF factory that we had built in Finis within Origin. We loaded up the longhook with as many resources as possible, because throughout the war our longhooks didn't have anything on it except BMATs and buckets for QRF purposes. But this time, we were going to take our Longhook on the offense as we now controlled the bridges and the canals that led into the western waters. So we aptly named our Longhook the Party Hook, as we decided that we were going to send this Longhook, as far north as possible and claim as many town bases and relic bases as possible. We did suspect that we would probably get curved by a Naki submarine that might sneak through the canals, but ultimately we decided to just have a little bit of fun. So we loaded up our Longhook with some reserve logistics, managed to steamroll the most of Stemma, managed to also steamroll a lot of Fisherman's Row, which notably was tapped back to tier 2 a couple of days prior due to some random partisans. But because of this, a large-scale invasion force was originating from our Party Hook, and we did manage to retap most of the town halls and all the burger bases and all the relic bases that were situated throughout the Warden-controlled islands. So again, motivation plays a key factor. The Wardens simply didn't QRF us fast enough. Ultimately, the Party Hook did die to a frigate that managed to come all the way from Morgan's Crossing. Not even the Callum's Cape frigate managed to come to get to us. So we did die, but ultimately the only thing that was really lost was the cost of the Longhook, as well as the reserve logistics that we put on top of it. But luckily for us, we're a logistics regiment. We quickly restocked. And because we had several Longhooks that were built in reserve for partisan activities, the Longhook that we lost was literally replaced within 5 minutes. I'm not even kidding. It took us a whole... It literally took the time for the Longhook at Idolo to sink, for me to redeploy back into Ashtown and move a new Longhook into position, which was 5 minutes worth of effort plus like 10 minutes worth of sailing. So okay, 15 minutes. Yeah, but that was just, again, the importance of motivation. Doesn't matter if you hold the islands. It doesn't matter if you have naval superiority. If you lack motivation to send something to go attack or defend, it just falls within a heartbeat. And the Wardens who held Stemma's Landing and Fisherman's Row for like 60 days of the war, maybe not, like 55 days of the war, basically had everything unseated. They lost all their bases within the span of an afternoon. And that's just how it went. All right, so HVL Party Hook. It was a lot of fun. We blasted a lot of music over bikes. It was kind of crazy, but the energy was high and the momentum was high. And hey, and we even had D3C's Grumpy Old Moo on board. So it was a fun field marshal moment as well. All right, this led us back to serious mode. We had our fun in the islands. We tapped all the things, broke the Warden naval morale. Next was one of the final operations that Sol took place, which again helped us push into the first W inside the Warden logistical backlines. Yes, we did claim Nevish line, but we wanted blood. We were after the MPF town of Callum's Keep. If we were able to break Callum's Keep, then we would surely win the war, as the Wardens would be one logistical town down. Now, very, very rarely do you come back from losing a logistical town. It sometimes happens, but very, very rarely. So we knew we had to take that MPF town. So a large-scale Sol operation was planned. And the big play here is because Nevish line managed to tech industry, we brought up all the logi that we had, literally down to the last crate of BMAT that was in the surplus for the Sol stockpiles. We brought everything into the Scrying Belt Seaport. We even managed to get VF, with the assistance of their facility partners core, to build up and supply a bluefin from all the public logi and all the remaining seaport logi that was available within the Sol stockpiles. And we brought the entire kitchen sink. We put everything into the Scrying Belt Seaport, and we did a massive push into Callum's Cape to break the Wardens and to take the Callum's Cape town hall for ourselves. The main contributing factor that Sol had throughout this fight is build pushing. We built up a massive base on the border base between Callum's Cape and Nevish line. We broke into that base while the Wardens were distracted with QRFing on the southern side. We built the north side completely up. We managed to sneak a rail along the rapid decay zone on the north side of the Scrying Belt. And the HVL artillery team brought Grond to bear onto the town hall itself. During this operation, it was a large-scale collaborative another soul/colonial faction effort to build up and protect the Railstorm cannon as it did work on Callum's Cape, on top of all the supporting artillery, tanks, infantry, and logi that was now being supplied from the Scrying Belt seaport. So because of this, we managed to safely build the Railstorm cannon and the railway into Callum's Cape, literally up into the town hall itself, and the Railstorm cannon alongside a very well-timed and well-coordinated Hydro Rush broke the town hall, and from there we simply just pushed this Railstorm cannon deeper and deeper into the town, sieging everything that we could at maximum range. It was during this fight we also managed to destroy the last remaining frigate and longhook that was protecting Callum's Cape from the naval museum that they had there, and ultimately this broke the final bit of Warden naval support that they had for the town. And so, with the longhook dead and the frigate dead, Callum's Cape was tapped. And the moment Callum's Cape was tapped, the rest of the hex basically fell from the pressure from the south side coming in from Stone Cradle once again. So again, massive push came in from Stone Cradle and everything was tapped within a day or two. So, this was a massive, major, soul-wide operation success. And just to illustrate, I took a screenshot of the final push base that we used to get into Callum's Keep, and this is more or less what took place. So we snuck the rail in from the RDZ, we pushed all the way to the oil field that was there, built up a large base. This was mostly built up by air, but obviously we also brought in a lot of mines and a lot of QRF teams to build and place mines everywhere. Most notably, a lot of Warden partisans, specifically guys from V, 82DK, KRGG, UKR, all the sweaty Warden partisan guys tried to sneak in and destroy the relic base, the Railstorm cannon. But because we had superior mine coverage and just a lot of people, high motivation, high ready to QRF, they just couldn't destroy the Railstorm cannon at every attempt. I think the closest they got was one dude got right next to the storm cannon with a 20 mil. I think he got like 5 or 6 shots in before our team of Dusk enjoyers managed to mow them down. I think that person was from a KRGG. I think KRGG was the closest to go and destroy Grand as we sieged into the town. But ultimately, like I said, it was a large-scale Soul operation. Everyone contributed. Para brought SPGs. Air built up the bases initially, then they switched to infantry. HVL was bringing in Logi. Everyone was involved, and ultimately that ended in a massive success. NCR, etc. Everyone contributed to the fall of Callum's Keep. So, because Callum's Keep was now tapped and it was green, all efforts went into teching industry. Now, I'm not going to go into too much details, but let's just say that a lot of wine was produced in the teching of industry in Callum's Cape. Once Callum's Cape did indeed turn green and the industries start to change colors, there was a massive loot box inside the Callum's Keep MPF seaport. Of course, there would be. Most of the remaining Warden regiments had all their supplies there, and I'm not even joking. I think we easily had over like 80 HGDs and 100 Silver Hands being built and deployed out of the seaport because it changed sides. So because of that, we also set up our MPF queues there. We started mass producing tanks, and then we ran into Q Hole. Now, for those who don't know, once the hexes start to become quite small in bandwidth for the amount of players that play the game, a lot of players tend to collate into singular hexes, which results in a large amount of waiting times from region to region. And it was during this time, which was near the very end of the war, so this was like day 68, day 69, day 70. Every single time we attempted to coordinate a large-scale Soul operation, we just couldn't. Unfortunately, this queue of vehicles and Logi that tried to get into Speaking Woods, which was our direct next target after the Callum's Cape logistical town. We just couldn't make it, as getting through the queue was basically impossible. So we just did what we could. Because Callum's Cape was a refinery town and an MPF town, we basically just brought up any remaining supplies, like raw supplies that we had, like crates of armats, crates of heavy explosives, crates of explosive powder. We set up a new facility in Callum's Cape, and we just supported everyone who attempted to get into Speaking Woods. That was our best play. That's what we did. And we had a new MPF town that we captured ourselves. And we were very happy to start building falchions and ballistas and stuff out of it. So, on top of HVL setting up a oil facility there to produce petrol, heavy oil to all the tanks that were going in for the fight. This is where the remainder of Sol managed to trickle into Speaking Woods to attempt to tap the final town. Unfortunately, we did not manage to get a coordinated, planned coalition operation into Speaking Woods because we just couldn't get the player slots. But ultimately, the final town was indeed tapped. This was Brody Town, I believe, so we didn't actually manage to get Tyne. But on day 70, the war was over, and the Colonials won a horrific victory, as the Wardens did manage to get some subtle achievements near the end of the war. So good on them for getting those as well. All right. And that was ultimately the result of War 126. Sol was the first coalition to manage to essentially win the lane and break into a MPF town. We did manage to hold back the Warden tide as they tried to flood the West Coast as much as possible. I think the only sort of thing that we had to our advantage is the Wardens didn't really try to send large ships all that much into Westgate to Origin. They were very, very fixated on taking Stemma's landing and then going into the Fingers. So I'm not entirely sure what the battle plan for that was, but ultimately we took advantage of it. We built our gains, and after a large turning point with the destruction of the dual nukes due to a colonial faction level operation, we managed to break through, and this resulted in the war ultimately ending after a very long and tenuous 40 to 50 day stalemate. All right, so closing thoughts. What did I think of War 126, and as well as just any sort of additional statements I would like to make about this war itself. Again, I just want to reiterate that I skipped a lot of details, as well as the smaller ops. I don't even go into details about the flamethrower ops that we had, the attack on Epstein Island that we had with Grand at Terra once we built up a bunker base there. I'm not talking about the numerous and unending amount of partisan ops that Air did to disrupt Warden logistics and destroy facilities. At one point, Air rushed 2 falchions and 2 spathers into a crane yard that was holding BTs, and geez, they destroyed 12 BTs or something in one night. It was absolutely insane. Unfortunately, I'm not going into all of that, as I mostly just focused on coalition level operations, and of course any major playing role that HVL had, as most of the time it was coordinated and illustrated, or coordinated and ultimately executed by the various council members from our regiment as well. I don't know why I said illustrated. Must be on my mind. Okay, so I skipped a lot of details, a lot of smaller ops, a lot of smaller facility operations as well. There were guys that were running M-sub facilities, love them to bits. Guys doing component farming, also very important to the war effort, so shout out to them. I just couldn't get through everyone, but ultimately, because of persistence and strategic decision making, Sol managed to push through, and we were there on the final line to try and win the war. Fortunately, we didn't get time. We got very close, and ultimately we took the first MPF town, and we actually managed to get industry, so we were making falchions on the Warden's doorstep. It was great. So again, thanks to all the regiments that helped out in the West, most notably the big op that took place on and against the Terra nukes. Again, shout out to Raid, as well as all the other regiments that brought large ships to attempt to destroy the final sort of hurdle to take out the nuke sites themselves. Thanks to everyone who brought Logi, thanks to all the attempts by 4th to do their rocket ops, as well as Royal, who constantly attacked them with their Tariuses, T3C that did their land leases to dump public Logi into seaports, etc., as they were necessary. Fort 20th, who managed to pull together, retake King's Cage after WCI basically just backed down and played defensively. Also very notable, they managed to take and hold Den of Knaves for the longest amount of time. I even did it, speaking of lacking details, we did a battle train there to help defend the Den of Knaves from a massive 27th counterattack. Ultimately, also thanks to everyone who managed to push in and take Stone Cradle. Even though Sol helped with those operations here and there, we weren't able to hold the grounds, we weren't able to build it up. We were stretched very, very thin by holding and maintaining Farragut Coast while the Warden Navy managed to counterattack into the Bonehaft. So you guys building it up and pushing in and winning your lanes ultimately led to the colonial victory. So thanks again for everyone who contributed in that. And again, if I missed your regiment specifically in the summaries, feel free to correct me in the YouTube comments, as, again, trying to get broad strokes here with what happened with this war to try and keep the runtime as short as possible. All right, strategic thoughts. Nukes matter in Foxhole. I know there's a meme with the Wardens going on where they say, every time you nuke us, we only get stronger. But nukes played a pivotal part of this war to break stalemates because we disrupted Logi. And I'm sorry to say this, and hopefully this is something that the Wardens tend to pick up going forward with their war efforts. You need to nuke strategic locations if it is being held by storm cannons. Storm cannons managed to hold the line for the majority of the war. Sol clashed headfirst into 5 storm cannons, 2 of which was built by JKL, 1 was built by 82DK, and 2 was built by Legio in the Manacle, and we couldn't get past the Westgate crumple zone. So because of this, we changed tactics. We switched to nukes, specifically air, spearheaded the nuke initiative within the Sol coalition. They dropped the first nuke, strategically taking out the Manacle, and that snowballed the logistical disruption throughout the rest of the war. I cannot understate that it is important that Logi has a constant supply of resources in seaports. Yes, bluefins are cool, but bluefins do not hold the line. Bluefins are a sudden, quick, strategic injection of materials to help with offensive operations, but when you're playing defensively, which is what the majority of the war was, you all need seaports, you need garages, you need factories, you need refineries. And if we nuke them, then your Logi has to spend an extra hour doing a basic task. This will burn players out. And this was intentional. We did it intentionally. We nuked storage depots and seaports because we knew that it would burn the Warden Logi out. There was no way you guys were going to get into Westgate without burning yourselves out. And that was the plan. And it worked. So, yes, the big key takeaway from War 126, in my opinion, was the fact that nukes turned the tide. And it was clearly evident as we were the leaders in hitting our nuke targets, on top of T3C and the West Side also building and nuking their targets as well. It was the nuclear war. 18 nukes landed. Clearly it works. So I think you need to reevaluate your memes a little bit. Notably, colonial teamwork peaked. I just talked about T3C, but Grumpy Old Moo and his nuclear project was insane. The amount of players that was involved in supplying the colonial faction with rare alloys so that we could build nukes and push and end the war was great. The amount of railstorm cannon ops that took place was awesome. The QRF involved, the amount of supplies that they got, the collaboration between creating 300ml and enriched oil to make sure that our artillery was constantly fueled was exceptional. Everyone contributed. Everyone had a chance to shine. Everyone got involved. On the West Coast, PH building their rails, their storm cannon 3 times before ultimately it getting destroyed. And they were there on the final push in their SPGs. They did work and it was awesome. One VR producing an endless amount of tanks for both the Soul Coalition as well as everyone on that Western Front was great. Banga producing their Railstorm Cannon. King producing their Storm Cannon. Everyone contributed, and it was great to finally see not just the coalition, but the colonial faction rally behind a singular flag was a sight to behold. And I think out of everything, the momentum that we had from destroying key Warden locations with nukes, Railstorm Cannons, SPGs, etc., basically just snowballed the enthusiasm as well as the morale to ultimately get everyone to push and win their lanes. Tier 2 slot made everything very difficult. Oh, this is one of the downsides I had. Man, building up a tier 2 base in friendly territory and then having it tech to tier 2 artillery garrisons made pushing very slow. And because of this, crumple zone pushing was a pain in the neck. I think I can speak for both the colonials that pushed into Victor after it got tapped, that it was nearly impossible to break without a storm cannon or a railstorm cannon, and for wardens when they tried to push south across the border into the gallows and reaching trail. Unless you had 300 mil, there was no way to destroy the endless amount of tier 2 bases that just popped up overnight. It was like a goddamn mushroom farm. Every single time you got any grounds, a tier 2 base would appear and you wouldn't be able to push any further. And it made a lot of artillery, a lot of usual artillery tactics quite daunting. 120 mil didn't see much action. Mortars didn't see any action. I could barely do any peltas up this war, purely because of just artillery garrisons being everywhere. So artillery tier 2, artillery howitzers, artillery garrison slop made it very difficult to push. So hopefully going forward, the devs address this and just tune down the numbers a little bit. We'll have to see how it goes. Notably, Storm Cannons and Tempest need a nerf. Their damage is too good. So I kind of like the approach that the devs have with adding in a heat mechanic to the game. I don't think the heat mechanic numbers are quite ready to really play out yet. Only being able to shoot 20 rounds off of an RSC seems a little bit on the too over-nerfed side. But luckily, this is something that the devs are probably going to hotfix throughout the war. I don't see them not tweaking these numbers, not evaluating and seeing what the best middle ground is. But without RSCs, the stalemates weren't able to be crushed. And because of that, storm cannons were insanely overpowered, because that was the only way that the war really progressed. So let's see how it goes. Hopefully some finer tuning with RSCs and storm cannons will make the game a little bit more enjoyable. But throughout this war, very predominant, very strong. And we personally made 3,000 to 4,000 300 mil rounds throughout the entire coalition itself. Alright, and then ships are no longer an all-in gambit. Sorry, naval enjoyers, both green and blue side. You can't just take your large ship and plop it in the back without any Logi support or Logi lines and hope to win. This was a very common tactic, specifically in War 117, where, you basically just flanked around the majority of the central bases and then broke the backline bases with naval invasions. Naval invasions are still important, I think, to take coastal regions, but you can't just rely on it. And again, this was quite evident this war, as any attempt at any large-scale naval operations faltered with the changes to 300 mil. Now, my end goal and hopefully sentiment to this is I would highly like to see a change to large hulls, not just with 300 mil, but torpedoes in general. It's an unfun mechanic for people who put the effort into building large ships and fielding them. So hopefully now we can have an honest conversation about large hulls, maybe seeing a nerf over time. But until people realize that large hulls suck, we're going to be stuck. So we'll keep at it for now. So it's nice that ships are no longer an all-in gambit, but ultimately both sides need to get together and say that enough's enough. We need to fix large hulls. Getting a large hull in your bluefin or your long hook as the naval fleet crosses the border is not great. Whether it's done by a torpedo or done by a 300 mil, it sucks. We can't have it. So we need to band together and make a plan to get rid of it. And then finally, I just want to have a shout out for good luck with World Conquest 127. HVL and most of Soul's on a break this war, so if you do manage to see any HVL or Soul members on the front, it's probably people just playing for fun. We desperately needed a break, and actually we planned this break before the war even started. So this is just a continuation of the promise that we had. So yeah, much deserved break. War 126 was a great war. It did drain us, and we are now ready to, dig our feet into the sand and just, watch the war play out on the next patch that the devs already cooked up for this war. All right, that's basically it. War 126. Please feel free to correct me in the YouTube comments if I made any mistakes. I did basically base the majority of this particular video off of the comms from the Soul Discord. If you have any questions, just feel free to ask them as well. And for the most part, again, the success for Soul in the western side was a colonial faction level contribution. It wasn't just any one moment throughout the entirety of Soul's participation in the war that won it for us. It was the fact that we got as much help as possible to kill the dual nukes and ultimately snowball us into victory. On top of all the smaller operations that took place, like Air doing partisan stuff, HVL doing daily train operations, NCR doing frontline work, Ember doing push bunkers, VF PvPing with ships. Everyone contributed, and that ultimately led to the West Coast success story. All right, but that's it for now. Thanks for sitting down for this sort of historical yap video to keep everything documented for this war. I don't think there's going to be another war in this length in Foxhole's history unless some drastic changes to the meta hits the sort of patch notes. But we'll see how things goes. So yeah, right, that's it from me. Thanks so much for listening in. And as always, feel free to leave your comments and questions in the comments below, and I'll get around to answering them. All right, this is HVL Legendary, signing off.